I was checking shelf life on plasma substitutes when the beacon came in. Not the way you imagine it, no klaxon, no red wash across the overhead lights, no boots hammering deck plates. Medical frigate ECV Sable Rest ran a quiet bridge. Captain Ennis believed that people who screamed during emergencies were people who hadn't prepared for them, and she ran her ship accordingly. So what I heard, standing in the lower deck supply bay with a crate of Kethvari-compatible hemostatic packs balanced on one knee, was a single chime, a two-note tone through the overhead speaker. Then Ennis's voice, flat and measured. All hands medical standby, distress beacon in sector, transit time 9 hours. Marin, get your kit. I set the crate down. I didn't rush. You learn not to rush on a medical frigate, because the rushing comes later. And if you've already spent your adrenaline checking shelf dates, you won't have any left for the field. I'd been aboard Sable Rest for 14 months. She was a restorative-class medical frigate, 62 meters, 4 trauma bays, a surgical suite that could handle 3 simultaneous operations, and a crew of 19. We ran the mid-corridor of Sector 12, Earth's quietest patrol zone, doing 3-week sweeps between the resupply waypoints. Most of our calls were minor. A freighter crew with a burst pipe and steam burns, a relay station tech who'd fallen from a maintenance scaffold, once a survey team that had eaten something on an uncharted moon and spent 3 days regretting it. I'd treated a fractured femur, 2 cases of decompression rash, and a cook who'd sliced his thumb deboning fish in 0G Sirius in each case. Routine in all of them. The distress beacon that came in at 7:14 on the morning of June the 6th was not routine. I didn't know that yet. I just knew that the chime had sounded, the captain had given me my name, and I had 9 hours to make sure my field pack was ready. I was good at that. I am good at that. It's the part of my job that doesn't require me to look anyone in the face. We were 3 ships in convoy, Sable Rest in the center, the supply transport Granary Hall on our port quarter, and the patrol corvette Cinder Dawn running escort ahead. Cinder Dawn had 7 crew and 2 light point defense arrays that she'd never fired outside of a calibration drill. Granary Hall carried 800 tons of general provisions, medical stores, emergency shelter kits, and 40 crates of a high-calorie nutrient paste that nobody aboard had ever tasted and nobody planned to. We were Sector 12 Medical Response Group, 5th rotation, and we had been dispatched because a distress beacon had activated at coordinates that fell inside our patrol corridor. Standard procedure. Nothing in the initial report suggested otherwise. I packed my field bag in the lower bay. Hemostatic packs, universal spectrum analgesics, a bone-setting kit, a portable vitals monitor that could be recalibrated for 11 known species, 2 liters of saline, 4 liters of Terran Standard plasma substitute, a breathing assist unit, a collapsible stretcher, and a hand torch. I added 3 extra rolls of wound closure strips. I always carried extra. My training sergeant at the Vashon Medical Academy had said, "Marin, you can run out of everything else and improvise. You run out of closure strips and someone bleeds." I'd never run out. I did not intend to start. The 9-hour transit was uneventful. I slept for 4 of it, a medic skill, sleeping on command, one that took me 2 years to learn and that I now perform as automatically as checking a pulse, an 8 for 1. The galley on Sable Rest was small, 6 seats around a bolted-down table, and the food was the same rotating menu of rehydrated protein, starch blocks, and canned vegetables that every restorative-class frigate serves. I ate without tasting. Duval, our second medic, sat across from me and ate the same way. We didn't talk. Duval was 31, former trauma nurse at the Terran Colonial Hospital on Brock Station, and she had a rule about pre-deployment meals. Eat everything, say nothing, think later. I liked Duval. She was the kind of medic who carried extra supplies without being asked, and who could hold a retractor for 6 hours without her hand shaking. She didn't make conversation when conversation wasn't needed. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She finished her starch block, wiped her hands on a disposable towel and said, "I've got Kethvari hemocyanin synthetics on the secondary shelf. 3rd generation. Check the lot numbers." "Good," I said. "If we need them. If we need them." She left. I sat at the table for another few minutes, looking at nothing, and then I went to the bridge annex to review the beacon's telemetry. I spent the remaining 4 hours there with Lieutenant Pell, our navigation officer. Pell was 26, thin-faced, meticulous, and had a habit of tapping his stylus against the edge of his console when something didn't sit right with him. He was tapping now. "Coordinates are clean," he said, "in sector. Right in our corridor, bearing 173, distance 4.2 light hours from our last waypoint." "What's at those coordinates?" "That's the thing." He pulled up the sector chart, a pale blue holographic grid with Earth's patrol corridor marked in amber. The beacon's origin point blinked steadily in the center of our corridor, right where it should be, but the region around it was empty. No stations, no registered traffic, no planets in our colony index. It should be uninhabited, just a gap between waypoint 6 and waypoint 9, but the beacon is planetary. Planetary. Surface origin, atmospheric attenuation in the signal. Someone is on the ground down there. I looked at the blinking dot. Planetary beacons meant settlements. Settlements meant people. People meant injuries, structural damage, breathable air concerns. I went back to the lower bay and added a second breathing assist unit to my pack. Then I sat on the crate of hemostatic packs and waited. We dropped from transit at 1611. I was on the bridge when the forward viewport cleared, and the planet resolved against the starfield like a thumbprint pressed into dark glass. It was amber, pale, dry amber, a rust-colored world with thin cloud bands and a wide arid plateau visible on the daylit hemisphere. There was no blue, no ocean. The atmosphere was thin enough that the limb of the planet faded quickly into black, and the surface features were visible from orbit: canyons, ridgelines, a flat expanse of pale dust that might have been a dry lake bed. "I have the settlement," Pell said. He was not tapping his stylus, he was gripping it. 47 structures, mining infrastructure, population estimate 600 to 800. And he stood behind him, one hand on the back of his chair. Species. Running the architecture against the recognition library now. A pause, then quietly, Kethvari. I looked at the captain, she looked at Pell. "That's sovereignty territory," and he said. "Yes, ma'am." "Kethvari sovereignty, Sector 14. "Yes, ma'am." She straightened. I watched her eyes move across the viewport, the amber planet, the settlement below, the coordinates blinking on the nav console. I could see her doing the arithmetic. Sector 12 is Earth's patrol corridor. Sector 14 is Kethvari sovereign space. They don't overlap. They don't even share a border. There are 2 buffer zones between them. "The beacon reads in sector," she said. "It does, ma'am." "But the settlement is Kethvari." "It is." Anise was quiet for 3 seconds. I counted them. Then she said, "Is the distress real?" Pell checked the beacon's telemetry again. "Yes, ma'am. Structural collapse signature. Atmospheric pressure anomaly consistent with subsurface breach. I'm reading an emergency-grade oxygen depletion curve on the embedded environmental data. This is a mine collapse." "How old is the signal?" 13 hours, accounting for propagation delay. Anise looked at the planet again. Then she said, "Take us in." Nobody argued. Nobody suggested we confirm with Sector Command first. Nobody said the words jurisdictional boundary or sovereignty or diplomatic clearance. The distress was real. We were 9 hours out and already on station. The captain took us in. I went to the lower bay and repacked my field bag with Kethvari-specific supplies. I trained on Kethvari physiology at the academy. They were one of the 11 species on the Universal Spectrum module. Bilateral symmetry, warm-blooded, copper-based hemocyanin instead of iron-based hemoglobin. Their blood ran pale blue-green. Their bones were denser than ours, harder to break but slower to heal. Their lungs were larger and less efficient, which meant they burned through breathable air faster under stress. A mine collapse with an oxygen depletion curve would hit them harder than it would hit us. I swapped the Terran plasma substitute for 2 liters of hemocyanin-compatible synthetic and added a Kethvari-calibrated pulse monitor. Then I sat on the deck with my back against the bulkhead and closed my eyes until I felt the shudder of atmospheric entry. We landed on a flat stretch of hardpan a quarter-kilometer from the settlement. The engines kicked dust, a fine ochre particulate that rose in a flat sheet and drifted south in the thin wind. Through the medical bay's narrow viewport, I watched the dust settle over the landing site and thought about how the surface looked like old leather, cracked and pale, baked by a sun that gave light without warmth. The landing gear thudded home. The deck vibrated once and went still. Vassar, our triage officer, keyed the ramp. The seal broke with a hiss of pressure equalization. The atmosphere outside was thinner than standard, about 83% of Earth normal at sea level, breathable but not comfortable. The air that came in was dry and carried a mineral smell, something like heated sandstone. The temperature was cool despite the bright sun. The thin atmosphere didn't trap heat well. I was the second person off the ramp. Vassar was first, and she stopped 3 steps onto the surface and didn't move. I nearly walked into her, then I looked up. Vareth Reach was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, a mining outpost maybe, a cluster of prefab shelters and processing sheds, something industrial and temporary. What I saw was a settlement that had been there for a long time. The buildings were low, broad, made of a pale gold composite material that looked like compressed sandstone, but caught the light with a faint metallic sheen. They were arranged in concentric rings around a central square, and every roofline carried a shallow curve, like the hull of an overturned boat. There were gardens, dry gardens, arid climate plantings with thick-stemmed gray-green vegetation, and clusters of something that looked like pale coral growing in raised beds of crushed stone. And in the central square, between the buildings and the mine entrance, there were people. The Kethvari of Vareth Reach were tall. Taller than I'd expected from the Academy's anatomical models, nearly 2 meters on average, with narrow builds and long, articulated fingers that bent at 4 joints instead of 3. Their skin was a smooth gray-blue like river stone, and their eyes were large, dark, and set wide on either side of a narrow face. They wore simple garments, long wraps of undyed cloth, work coveralls in muted ochre, a few in heavier gear that I recognized as mining equipment. They were gathered in the square, several hundred of them. Some were sitting. Some were standing with their arms folded across their chests in a posture I didn't recognize. A few were moving slowly between groups, carrying water or food. And near the mine entrance, a dark opening in the hillside, partially obscured by a collapsed retaining wall and a haze of fine dust, there were figures lying on the ground. Wounded. I moved. Vassar was already calling it in over the comm. Sable rest, this is triage lead. We have mass casualty indicators. I count 30 to 40 wounded visible in the settlement square, requesting full medical deployment. Behind us, the ramp of Granary Hall was already lowering, and I could hear Cinder Dawn's engines overhead as she took up a low orbital position. The first Kethvari I reached was sitting on the ground with his back against a low stone wall. His left arm was folded against his chest at an angle that told me the humerus was broken before I touched him. His skin was pale, paler than the others, which I later learned was a Kethvari shock indicator, the hemocyanin retreating from the peripheral tissue. He looked up at me and said something I didn't understand. My translator took a moment to calibrate. "The shaft," he said. "The second level it came down." "I know," I said. "Hold still." I set his arm, applied a stabilization sleeve, and gave him a measured dose of analgesic calibrated for his body weight. He watched me the entire time with those wide, dark eyes, and when I finished, he said, "You are not Kethvari. No. You are not sovereignty. No, we're Earth." He stared at me. I could not read his expression. The Kethvari face doesn't move the way ours does, and I hadn't yet learned to read the small shifts around the eyes and the corners of the mouth that carry their emotional register. But he stared at me for a long time, and then he turned his head and looked at the sky, where the belly of Granary Hall was visible through the thin cloud cover, descending toward a second landing site. "Earth," he said. "Earth," I said, "we're here to help. Where are your most critical cases?" He pointed toward the mine entrance. I went. "The next 3 hours are the part I don't tell well. I'll tell you what I can. There were 41 wounded in the square and in the structures nearest the shaft entrance. 11 were critical, crush injuries from the collapse, most of them in the legs and lower torso, several with compromised breathing from dust inhalation. Our team of 4 medics and 2 surgical techs from Sable Rest worked the square while Vassar ran triage from a folding table set up under an awning that the Kethvari had rigged from mining tarps. Granary Hall's crew unloaded shelter kits, portable oxygen concentrators, and water purification units. The Kethvari watched them do it. Not with suspicion, I want to be clear about that, not with hostility. They watched the way you watch something you cannot explain and have decided not to try to explain yet. They accepted the oxygen concentrators. They accepted the water. They let us treat their wounded, but they watched. I treated 19 patients in those first 3 hours. I set bones, closed lacerations, stabilized a pneumothorax with a Kethvari-calibrated chest tube, and talked a miner through a panic episode when his breathing mask ran dry and the portable concentrator took 45 seconds to cycle. 45 seconds is not a long time if you're standing in a warm room breathing normally. 45 seconds is a lifetime if you're a Kethvari miner with lungs already stressed from dust inhalation, and you've just watched your oxygen supply read 0. I held his arm, gently, because the skin was bruised and the muscle beneath was trembling, and counted out loud in a steady cadence until the concentrator cycled and the mask filled. He gripped my wrist with those long, 4-jointed fingers and held on for a full minute after the air came back. Then he let go, very carefully, as if he were setting down something fragile, and he didn't look at me. I used every closure strip in my pack and borrowed a roll from Duval, who had brought extra because I'd once told her to. There was a woman, a mining supervisor I learned later, named Esrath Kellen, cousin to the mine coordinator, who had a compound fracture of the left radius that had broken the skin. The bone was visible. The wound was dirty mine dust, particulate, fragments of composite material embedded in the tissue. I cleaned it under a field irrigation kit, debrided the contaminated tissue with a scalpel and a steady hand, reduced the fracture, applied a hemostatic membrane, and set the bone with a rigid frame stabilizer. She watched the entire procedure without speaking. When I finished, she flexed the fingers of her left hand, slowly testing, and said, "You have done this before." "I have." "On Kethvari?" "No, on humans, on Theresi, on 2 Velen crew members aboard a cargo hauler last year. The bone-setting protocol is universal spectrum. I adapted it." She looked at the stabilizer on her arm. "Adapted," she said. Then she looked at me with something that was not suspicion and not gratitude, but was, I think, the Kethvari version of measuring someone, assessing their weight, their seriousness, the quality of their attention. "Your adapted work is clean," she said. "Thank you." The Sovereignty medical team set bones differently. They use a thermal mold. It is slower. "This is what I have." "It is enough." She stood and went back to the square. I watched her walk away, upright, left arm held carefully against her chest, her stride steady, and then I moved to the next patient. It was during the 4th hour that I saw the chaplain. I had moved from the square to a low building near the mine entrance, a community hall of some kind, with a wide central room and long benches along the walls. The Kethvari had converted it into a recovery ward. Wounded miners lay on the benches, wrapped in thermal blankets, breathing from portable concentrators that hummed in a low, steady rhythm. The light came through narrow windows set high in the walls, cutting pale amber shafts across the room. At the far end, where the room opened into a smaller alcove with an arched ceiling, there was a figure kneeling on the floor. The figure was old. I could tell by the deeper shade of the skin, a dark blue-gray, like slate, and by the way the long fingers rested on the ground, palms down, with a stillness that suggested they had been in that position for a long time. The figure wore a plain garment, undyed, with a single band of woven thread at the collar that I later learned marked the keeper of rites. In front of the kneeling figure, arranged in a careful row on a piece of flat stone, were 7 small objects. I couldn't see what they were from the doorway. I learned later that they were mineral tokens and polished fragments of the ore that the Selene vein shaft produced, one for each miner still trapped below. The Kethvari keeper of rites places a token for each soul in the earth and keeps vigil until the soul is returned or confirmed lost. 7 miners still trapped. The chaplain Sarath Cohn, though I didn't know the name yet, was kneeling before them, and the kneeling was not idle. It was not passive. The Kethvari morning vigil is a sustained act of attention. The keeper does not sleep. The keeper does not eat. The keeper does not look away from the tokens. The keeper stays, and the staying is the prayer. I stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. I should have moved on. I had patience. But there was something in the stillness of that room, the amber light, the sound of breathing from the wounded, the kneeling figure at the far end that stopped me. Sarath Cohn looked up. The eyes were darker than the others, almost black, and in them, as they settled on me, on my Earth-standard medical coveralls, on the hemostatic stains on my gloves, on the insignia stitched above my left pocket, I saw something I did not expect. Not fear. Not anger, not gratitude. Confusion. Quiet, deep, unreachable confusion. The face didn't change. The hands didn't move. But the eyes tracked me with the expression of someone who has heard a sound that should not exist and is waiting to be told they imagined it. "You are the healer," Sarath said. "I'm a medic, Corporal Tess Marin, Earth Medical Response." "Earth?" "Yes. We did not call Earth." I paused. "We received your distress beacon. It came in on our patrol channel inside our sector." Sarath's hands pressed slightly against the stone floor. The long fingers flexed once and then went still. "The beacon calls the Sovereignty Patrol in Sector 14. We pressed the beacon when the shaft collapsed." That was a pause, and I watched the dark eyes calculate. 17 hours ago. "We received it 13 hours ago, transited 9. 13 hours ago, Sarath repeated. "The beacon has been active for 17. The Sovereignty has not come." "We came." Sarath looked at me for a long time. Then the chaplain's gaze moved past me, through the doorway, past the recovery ward, past the square, to the amber sky where the silhouette of Granary Hall sat on the hardpan, and the supply ramp was still open. "We did not send for you," Sarath said. "It was not an accusation. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact delivered in a voice so steady it could have been reading from a maintenance log. We pressed the beacon. The beacon calls the Sovereignty. We did not send for Earth." "I understand," I said. "We're here anyway." I went back to my patients. It was Lieutenant Pell who found the error. He told me about it that evening, in the supply tent that Granary Hall's crew had set up beside the settlement's central square. The sun was low, a wide, amber disk dropping behind the canyon ridgeline to the west, and the temperature had fallen enough that I could see my breath in the thin air. "The beacon's positioning module," Pell said. He had his tablet out and was scrolling through lines of code that I couldn't read. It uses a galactic reference frame catalog, a table that maps the colony's physical location to a standard coordinate set. The catalog is supposed to be updated every time the Interstellar Reference Bureau issues a new epoch correction. That's roughly every 5 years, sometimes more often if there's a significant adjustment. And Vareth Reach's catalog hasn't been updated in 19 years. I set down my ration pack. 19 years. 19 years, 2 months, and 6 days if we're being exact. The colony was established 31 years ago. They updated the catalog twice in the first 12 years, once at founding, once at the first epoch correction. Then they stopped. I don't know why. Maybe the technician who handled it left. Maybe it was a manual process and nobody thought to assign it. But for 19 years, the beacon has been encoding this colony's position using a reference frame that's 3 epochs out of date. What does that mean? It means that when the beacon fires, it doesn't say we're at the actual physical coordinates of Kethvar-Selen in Sector 14 of the Kethvari sovereignty. It says we're at the coordinates that Kethvar-Selen used to occupy in a reference frame that hasn't been current since before I was born. And those coordinates in the current epoch standard fall inside Earth's Sector 12. I looked at the tablet, then I looked at Pell. The beacon told us they were in our sector. It told everyone they were in our sector. It fired on broadband emergency. Every receiver in range got the same signal with the same coordinates. The Kethvari sovereignty's emergency monitoring system would have received it too. But the sovereignty system reads the coordinates, checks them against its own sector map, and sees a location that's outside its territory. Standard protocol: flag it, log it, forward it to the relevant jurisdiction, which, as far as the coordinates say, is us. So the sovereignty got the beacon too. They got it. They read the coordinates. They saw it wasn't in their sector. They logged it and moved on. They may have forwarded it to us as a jurisdictional handoff, but we'd already received it direct. And the colony was sitting here waiting for the sovereignty. The colony pressed the beacon expecting the sovereignty. The beacon told the galaxy they were in Earth's territory. We were the closest asset. He set the tablet down. 19 years of reference frame drift, that's all it was. I thought about that for a long time after Pell left. 19 years, not a conspiracy, not a diplomatic maneuver, not an act of aggression or deception. A firmware table that nobody updated because nobody remembered it needed updating, and a reference frame that drifted the way all reference frames drift, slowly, imperceptibly across epochs, until the coordinates that used to mean here, in our sovereign space, now meant there, in Earth's patrol corridor. The colony had called their own people. The mathematics had called us. I went back to the recovery ward. It was dark now. The thin atmosphere didn't hold heat, and the stars were visible through the narrow windows, sharp and close. The wounded were sleeping. The portable concentrators hummed. The amber light of the settlement's interior lamps, bioluminescent fixtures mounted in the walls, casting a warm, low glow, made the room feel like the inside of a lantern. At the far end in the alcove, Sareth Cohn was still kneeling. 7 tokens on the stone, 7 miners in the earth. The Kethvari medical attendants had tried to bring Sareth food twice during the afternoon. Both times, the chaplain had shaken that narrow head once, a single, definitive motion, and the attendants had withdrawn. The vigil was absolute. I'd seen exhaustion before, in patients and in fellow medics, and I recognized the particular quality of Sareth's stillness, the way the body goes quiet when the will is the only thing holding it upright. The chaplain's hands, flat on the stone, were trembling faintly. The long fingers pressed into the floor as if drawing something from it. I didn't know then whether the trembling was from exhaustion or from the sustained effort of attention that the vigil demanded. I learned later that it was both, and that the Kethvari consider the trembling a sign that the vigil is working. that the keeper's body is communicating with the stone, which communicates with the ore, which communicates with the earth, which holds the ones who are below. I sat on a bench near the doorway and didn't speak. I had nothing to say. The chaplain knew we were there. The chaplain knew we hadn't been called. The chaplain was kneeling for the 7 who were still below, and the kneeling was a language I didn't have a translation for, but I recognized it the way you recognize grief in any species, by the posture, by the silence, by the sustained attention that refuses to look away. After a while, Sareth spoke without turning. "How many of yours are here?" 19 crew on Sable Rest, 8 on Granary Hall, 7 on Cinder Dawn, 34 total. 34. The voice was low and even, for a colony of 712. That's what we had. You brought a warship. Cinder Dawn is a patrol corvette. She's running escort. She's not armed for anything serious. You brought a supply vessel. Granary Hall, 800 tons of provisions, medical stores, shelter kits. For a colony you did not know existed. We knew someone was in distress. We didn't know who. Sareth's head turned just slightly. I could see the edge of the chaplain's profile, the narrow jaw, the smooth gray-blue skin, the dark eye catching the light from the concentrator's indicator panel. You came to coordinates inside your own territory and found someone else's colony. You landed. You treated our wounded. You unloaded supplies. Yes. And you did not stop. No. You did not contact your authorities. You did not wait for permission. The captain made a judgment call. The distress was real. Sareth was quiet for a long time. Then, "The sovereignty will come. They are slow. They were always slow. The Vareth corridor is 3 transit jumps from the nearest patrol station, and the sovereignty does not keep a medical asset in the region. They will come, but they will be late. They are always late for Vareth reach." "We're here now," I said. "You were not supposed to be," Sareth said, and the voice didn't break, and the hands didn't move from the stone, but I heard something in the sentence that I didn't have a word for then and still don't have a word for now. It wasn't anger. It wasn't gratitude. It was the sound of a person stating a fact that contradicts the shape of the world they have spent their life understanding. "You were not supposed to be here. You were never in our directory. We pressed the beacon for our own people. We knelt for our own dead. We waited for our own ships on a horizon that belongs to our own sky. And you came anyway." I didn't answer. I sat on the bench in the dark recovery ward with the concentrators humming and the stars visible through the narrow windows, and I listened to the chaplain breathe, and I waited for morning. Morning came amber and thin, the way mornings come on an arid world with a low-density atmosphere. The sun was a white disk, not warm the way Earth's sun is warm, but bright enough to wash the settlement in pale gold light. I stepped out of the recovery ward at 5:30 local and found the square already active. Captain Ennis had organized a rescue operation during the night. I hadn't been told because I'd been on patient rotation, but Ennis and the Kithvari settlement coordinator, a tall, sharp-featured woman named Esrath Ven who ran the mine, had spent 5 hours over a shared schematic of the Sellenvane shaft, identifying the collapse points, the ventilation routes, and the most likely locations of the 7 trapped miners. Cinder Dawn's crew had contributed something I didn't expect. Lieutenant Commander Roth, the corvette's co, had served a previous tour on an Earth Geological Survey team and had experience with subsurface structural assessment. He came down from orbit with 2 of his crew, a portable seismic scanner, and a cutting tool designed for asteroid sampling that he thought could be recalibrated to cut through Kithvari mining composite. It could. They tested it at 600 on a section of collapsed retaining wall, and the tool went through the composite like a blade through wet clay. Esrath Ven stood beside Roth and watched the cut, and then she looked at him and said, "That is not a mining tool." "No, ma'am," Roth said. "It's a rock cutter. We use it on asteroids." You brought an asteroid sampling tool to a medical response. I brought it to my patrol corvette. It was in the equipment locker. He shrugged. Seemed useful. They started cutting at 6:30. The shaft was a vertical bore that dropped 90 meters into the plateau's basalt substrate, with lateral galleries branching off at 3 levels. The collapse had occurred at the second level. A section of gallery roof had given way, dropping roughly 800 tons of rock onto the passage floor and sealing the galleries beyond. The 7 trapped miners were somewhere past the blockage, in a section of the third level that Esrath Ven believed was still structurally intact. The third level is basalt, Ven said, standing at the shaft entrance with Roth and Captain Ennis, a schematic of the mine projected from a portable display unit. Harder stone. The second level runs through a transition layer, basalt above, a compressed sedimentary band below. The sedimentary band is what failed. It's been stable for 31 years, but the extraction on the second level widened the gallery over time, and the support pillars were not reinforced after the last survey. When was the last survey? Ennis asked. 11 years ago. And the support reinforcement? Ven's expression didn't change, but her hands, those long Kethvari fingers, closed briefly at her sides. It was requisitioned. It was not fulfilled. The Sovereignty Infrastructure Program has a backlog. Verath Reach is far from the administrative center. Nobody said anything about that. There was nothing to say. Ennis looked at the schematic, then at Roth, then at the shaft entrance. Can you reach the collapse point from the first level? We'd have to cut laterally through the transition band and come up under the blockage, Roth said. It's risky. The transition layer is the weak stone. If we cut through it, we could trigger a secondary collapse. What about going straight through the blockage? 800 tons of mixed rubble. We'd need heavy equipment we don't have. The cutting tool will go through individual blocks, but we can't clear the mass. Third option. Roth tapped the schematic. The ventilation shaft. There's a secondary bore, an air supply channel that runs parallel to the main shaft and connects to the third level at a junction point beyond the collapse. It's narrow, 60 centimeters at the widest. A human can't fit. A Kethvari can. Ven looked at the schematic. A small one, maybe, with difficulty. Can we widen it? With the cutting tool, yes, if the stone holds. That was the plan. Roth and his crew would use the asteroid sampling cutter to widen the ventilation shaft from 60 centimeters to 90, enough for a person with a rebreather and a medical kit to crawl through. A Kethvari miner named Doroth Selm volunteered to go first, because she was the smallest person in the colony who knew the third-level layout, and because she had a sister on the other side of the collapse. I was not part of the cutting team. I was in the square, treating the overnight patients, checking vitals on the critical cases, replacing oxygen concentrators that had run through their cartridges. But I could hear the cutting tool, a high, sustained whine that carried across the settlement and echoed off the canyon walls, and I could see the plume of fine dust rising from the shaft entrance, and I could see the Kethvari watching it. They were quiet. That was the thing. 700 people and the settlement was quiet. Not silent, there were children, and the children made sounds, and there were conversations in low voices, and there was the clatter of meal preparation from the community kitchens. But the adults were quiet the way adults are quiet when the thing they are waiting for is still below the ground, and has not yet been resolved. Sarath Cohn emerged from the recovery ward at mid-morning. The chaplain walked slowly, not from age, I think, but from the particular exhaustion of a sustained vigil that had lasted more than 20 hours. The long fingers were curled loosely at the sides. The garment was wrinkled and dust-stained at the knees where it had pressed against the stone floor. The face, in the bright morning light, showed the deeper blue-gray coloring that marks fatigue in a Kethvari, the hemocyanin pooling in the dermal tissue, a visible weight of spent effort. But the dark eyes were clear. They found the shaft entrance, tracked the dust plume, and then found me. How many? Sarath asked. Of the surface wounded, all 41 are stable, 3 are still critical but improving. No fatalities overnight. Your medics did this. We did our job. Sarath looked at the shaft entrance again, and the 7. Captain Ennis has a rescue team in the shaft. They're cutting through the collapse point. Lieutenant Commander Roth, from the escort corvette, brought a tool that can cut the composite. The escort corvette? Yes. The warship, you said, was not armed for anything serious. She's not. She's a patrol corvette. But her co has experience with geological survey work, and he brought a cutting tool. Sarath closed those dark eyes for a moment. When they opened, they were still dark, still unreadable, but the lid stayed at half-mast in a way that I had started to recognize as the Kethvari expression for something between resignation and wonder. You were not sent here, Sarath said. We were dispatched to these coordinates. You were dispatched to coordinates that are not ours. The coordinates that our beacon reported are a mathematical error. 19 years of uncorrected drift in the positioning module placed our settlement inside your patrol territory. When the shaft collapsed, the beacon fired, and the signal told your patrol channel that a distress event had occurred inside your jurisdiction. Your system read it as one of your own settlements in danger. We know, I said. Our navigation officer identified the drift last evening. You know, Sarath's voice was perfectly level. You know the beacon was not meant for you. You know the coordinates were wrong. You know this colony is in Kethvari sovereign space, in a sector that is not yours, among people who did not call you. Yes. And you are still here. The distress is real, I said. The 7 are still below. The coordinates don't change that. Sarath looked at me, and I looked at the chaplain, and the amber sun was behind the chaplain's head, and the fine dust from the shaft was drifting across the square, and neither of us spoke for a while. Then Sarath said, I have kept vigil for 17 of your hours, 7 tokens on the stone, 7 miners in the earth. The vigil is for the sovereignty, for the ships that were meant to come. The rites are spoken in the language of our compact. The prayers are addressed to the registry of the dead, which is maintained by the Kethvari Bureau of Souls. I understand. You cannot understand. The vigil is not yours. The rites are not yours. The 7 who are trapped are not your people, and the stone on which the tokens rest is not your ground, and the beacon that called you was aimed at someone else. I waited. But you are the ones who are here, Sarath said. You are the ones with the cutting tool and the oxygen concentrators, and the medic who set Doran's arm before his shock deepened. You are the ones who landed 3 ships on a world you did not know existed, for coordinates that are not real, to answer a signal that was never meant for you. That's correct. Then I will keep the vigil for you too. The chaplain turned and walked back into the recovery ward. I stood in the square with the dust drifting and the cutting tool whining and the amber sun climbing, and I understood that something had been said that I did not have the training to fully parse, but that I recognized in the way you recognize any act of grace, by the cost of it. They brought the first miner up at 1340. The cutting team, Roth and 2 of his crew, working alongside 4 Kethvari miners who knew the gallery layout, had widened the ventilation shaft to 92 centimeters by 1100. Doroth Seln had crawled through at 1115 with a rebreather, a comm unit, and a medical pouch strapped to her back. She made contact with the trapped miners at 1148. I know the time because Ennis logged every minute of the operation and reported back, 7 alive, all conscious, 2 with injuries that limited their mobility, 1 with a leg pinned under a fallen support beam. The air was bad. The rebreathers were running on reserve. Seln estimated 2 hours before the reserve ran out entirely. Roth's crew widened the ventilation shaft further, to 110 centimeters, and rigged a rope and harness system for extraction. The first two miners came through on their own power, crawling through the widened bore with Seln guiding them from the far side and Roth's crew receiving them on the near side. The process was slow. Each miner took roughly 20 minutes to make the crawl, 35 meters of narrow stone passage, on hands and knees, in thin air, wearing a borrowed rebreather. I was at the shaft entrance when they carried the first one out. A Kithvari woman mid-age, her coveralls torn and her skin pale from oxygen deprivation. Her eyes were open but unfocused. I checked her vitals, hemocyanin saturation dangerously low, heart rate elevated, respiration shallow, and started her on supplemental oxygen from one of the concentrators, while Duval set up an IV line with hemocyanin-compatible synthetic. The second came up at 13:55, the third and fourth together at 14:20, the fifth at 14:40, the sixth at 15:02. Each time I was at the entrance. Each time I did the same thing: vitals, oxygen, hemocyanin support, stabilization. The Kithvari miners who had been part of the cutting team helped carry them out, and when each one emerged, a low sound went through the crowd in the square. Not a cheer, not a cry, but a sustained, resonant hum that I felt in my sternum. The seventh miner came up at 15:31. He was the worst, and the last, because the team had to cut the support beam off his leg before they could move him, and cutting a beam in a confined space with a tool designed for asteroid sampling took Roth's crew 90 minutes of careful work, while Seln held the miner's hand and talked to him in a low, steady voice that I could hear over the comm channel. His leg was trapped for most of the 23 hours, and by the time Roth's team freed him, the tissue below the knee was necrotic, gray-black, cold, no circulation. The hemocyanin had retreated entirely. The bone was intact, but the soft tissue was dead, and dead tissue in a Kithvari limb goes toxic fast. Their physiology doesn't compartmentalize the way ours does. A dead limb will poison the trunk within hours. Our surgical tech, Warrant Officer Aldis, made the call on the field. The leg could not be saved. We performed the amputation in the recovery ward, on a bench cleared and sterilized with field-grade antiseptic, with 2 Kithvari medical attendants assisting, because Aldis needed someone who understood Kithvari vascular mapping, and our anatomical references were not detailed enough for the procedure. One of the attendants, a quiet, methodical woman named Sareth Venn, the chaplain's niece, a trained colonial medic, guided Aldis through the vascular tie-offs with a precision that I would have expected from a surgeon with 10 years of residency. The amputation took 40 minutes. Aldis worked in silence. Duval managed the anesthetic. I handled the vitals monitor and the hemocyanin drip. The Kithvari attendants held the surgical field and clamped when told to clamp. Nobody spoke except to give instructions or confirm status. The room smelled of antiseptic and copper, the faint metallic scent of Kithvari blood, which runs pale blue-green and carries a smell like wet pennies. The miner survived. His name was Solith Reach, the same name as the settlement because in Kithvari tradition, the first miner to work a new shaft gives the settlement its name. He was the founder. He was the oldest man in the colony, and he had been on the 3rd level because he still went down every shift, even at his age, because the shaft was his, and he would not send people into a place he would not go himself. When Aldis finished the amputation and Solith was stabilized, I stepped out of the recovery ward and sat on the ground with my back against the wall. It was late afternoon. The amber light was thick and low. My hands were steady. They are always steady. It is the one thing about me that has never failed, but the rest of me was very tired. Sareth Cohn came out of the ward behind me. The chaplain stood for a moment, then sat on the ground beside me. We did not look at each other. We looked at the settlement, the concentric rings of pale gold buildings, the gardens with their gray-green plantings and pale coral clusters, the dust still drifting from the shaft entrance, the 3 Earth ships on the hardpan beyond. 7 tokens, Sareth said. 7 returned. Yes. Solith will live. He'll live, he lost the leg. He will say the leg was a fair trade. A pause. He will be wrong, but he will say it and we will let him because he is Solith and the shaft is his. We sat in the amber light and didn't speak for a while. Then Serath said, I have been keeper of rights for Verath Reach for 22 years. I have kept vigil 9 times. Twice the sovereignty came. The other 7 times we resolved the matter ourselves, our own medics, our own miners, our own tools. The sovereignty is not unkind. They are distant. We are a small colony in a far corridor and they have many corridors and we understand this. They'll come, I said. The transit time from their nearest patrol station is long, but they'll come. They will come, and they will find you already here. They will find their wounded treated, their miners extracted, their shaft secured. They will find Earth's medical frigate, Earth's supply transport, and Earth's patrol corvette sitting on the hardpan beside a colony that is not in Earth sector, has never been in Earth sector, and called a beacon that was aimed at someone else. That's about right. They will ask how this happened. And we'll tell them, 19 years of drift in the positioning catalog, their coordinates mapped to our territory, we came. That simple. That simple. Serath turned those dark eyes toward me. Corporal Marin, I have been keeper of rights for 22 years. I have prayed for the return of miners from the earth. I have prayed for rain on a world that does not rain. I have prayed for the sovereignty to remember that we are here, a long breath. I have never prayed for Earth. I did not know to. The beacon did not know to. The firmware did not know to. And yet, I said, you came to a set of numbers that were wrong and found people who were real. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm a medic. I carry closure strips and hemostatic packs and a portable vitals monitor that can be recalibrated for 11 known species. I'm trained to stop bleeding, set bones, stabilize airways, and keep people alive until someone more qualified arrives. I am not trained to answer the kind of thing Serath Cone said to me on the ground outside the recovery ward in the amber light of a world that was never in my patrol corridor. But I sat with the chaplain until the sun went down, and when the stars came out sharp and close in that thin atmosphere, I went back inside and checked on Solith Reach, who was sleeping with his remaining leg drawn up and his hand resting on the stump where the other one used to be, and who, when he opened his eyes and saw me, said, Earth. Earth, I said. We didn't call you. I know. He closed his eyes. Good, he said. Good that you came. The Kethvari Sovereignty Patrol arrived 41 hours after the beacon fired. 3 vessels, a sector patrol cruiser, a logistics transport, and a small medical cutter. They came in fast, dropped to low orbit, and hailed the settlement. Captain Ennis took the call on the bridge of Sable Rest and explained in her flat, measured voice exactly what had happened. The beacon, the coordinates, the drift, the mine collapse, the extraction, the 7 miners, the amputation, the supplies. I was in the recovery ward when the sovereignty ships appeared overhead. Through the narrow windows I could see their shapes against the amber sky, darker, larger than our ships, with the angular hull geometry that Kethvari military vessels favor. Serath Cone was in the alcove. The 7 tokens were no longer on the stone. They had been collected, polished, and returned to the ore bin at the shaft entrance, the vigil completed. The chaplain sat on a low bench now, watching the wounded sleep. The sovereignty, Serath said, looking at the shapes through the window. Yes. They come. They do. Serath was quiet for a moment. Then, 41 hours. The shaft collapsed 41 hours ago. Your ships arrived in 9. The sovereignty arrives in 41. There was no anger in the voice. There was no accusation. It was the same flat, measuring tone, the Kethvari way of stating a fact and letting the fact carry its own weight. The Sovereignty Patrol commander, a senior officer named Verath Tone, who shared the settlement's name because he was Solith Reach's nephew, listened to Ennis's entire explanation without interruption. Then he said, You are in Kethvari sovereign space. I'm aware, Ennis said. You landed without clearance. The distress was real. It was, a pause, it is, thank you, Captain. There was a meeting, brief, professional, conducted in the community hall between Ennis Roth, Verath Tone, and Esrath Ven. I wasn't present. Pell told me about it afterward. Tone had brought a formal jurisdictional inquiry form that required Ennis's signature, and he signed it without reading it. Tone looked at the unsigned fields, the ones for diplomatic clearance, pre-entry authorization, sector command notification, and said, "These are blank." "They were blank when we arrived," Ennis said. "We didn't have time to fill them." "Captain, the protocol requires." "The protocol requires that I respond to a distress beacon inside my patrol corridor." The beacon was inside my patrol corridor. The coordinates were wrong, but I didn't know that until we were on the ground and the miners were bleeding. Tone looked at the form. Then he folded it and put it in his coat. "I'll file it as received," he said. Pell told me that Tone's face, when he said it, carried the particular Kethvari expression that means a person has decided not to argue with a fact. They landed their own medical cutter and relieved our team at the recovery ward. They brought supplies, Kethvari-specific surgical equipment, medication we didn't carry, dietary supplements calibrated for long-term recovery. They took over the shaft assessment and began structural reinforcement of the second level. They were professional. They were competent. They were 41 hours late, and they knew it, and nobody said it out loud. We left Verath Reach on the evening of the second day. I spent the last hour before departure walking through the settlement, not on duty, not checking patients, just walking. The concentric rings of pale gold buildings. The gardens with their gray-green plantings and pale coral clusters. The mine entrance, where the Sovereignty engineering team was now running a structural assessment with equipment that looked newer and heavier than anything the colony had ever owned. The Kethvari watched me walk. Some of them nodded, a small, downward tilt of the head that I had learned was their acknowledgement between professionals. A few of the children followed at a distance, curious, until a parent called them back. One of the miners I'd treated, the man whose arm I'd set on the first afternoon, whose name I later learned was Doran Keth, saw me from across the square and raised his good hand, palm outward. I returned it. Captain Ennis filed a standard incident report with Sector 12 Command, noting the coordinate drift, the in-territory distress beacon, the humanitarian response, the Kethvari Sovereignty's arrival and assumption of operations. She recommended that Earth's Terran Patrol Service issue a technical advisory to all non-aligned colonies regarding periodic reference frame catalog updates. The report was 62 pages. Ennis wrote every word of it herself, in the same flat, precise prose that she used when speaking. I read it 3 months later when it passed through the Medical Review Board. It was the clearest operational summary I have ever encountered. It named every patient. It logged every procedure. It noted every supply item transferred. It did not, anywhere in its 62 pages, use the word heroic. It used the word appropriate 4 times. Sarath Cone came to the ramp of Sable Rest before we departed. The chaplain walked slowly across the hardpan in the late amber light, carrying something in those long, 4-jointed fingers. It was a mineral token, polished, a pale, glinting fragment of the ore that the Celenvane shaft produced, the same kind that had been laid on the stone floor of the alcove during the vigil. Sarath held it out to me. "For the healer," the chaplain said. I took it. It was small, no larger than the pad of my thumb, and warm from being held. It had a faint translucence, like clouded glass, and when I tilted it in the light, a thin vein of copper green ran through the center. "The vigil tokens are returned when the miners come home," Sarath said. 7 went down, 7 came home. The tokens are returned to the ore, but I kept 1. For me. For the ones who came to numbers that were wrong and stayed for people who were real. I put the token in my breast pocket. I still have it. It sits on my desk now, in a small ceramic dish that I bought at a market on Fairfield Station 3 years ago, next to a photograph of my training class at the Vashon Medical Academy, and a folded letter that arrived 11 months after we left Verath Reach. The letter was handwritten, in Kethvari script, on a thin, translucent paper that felt like pressed mineral fiber. I had a colleague at the Academy's language department translate it for me. It was from Sarath Cohn. The handwriting, my colleague said, was precise and unhurried, the script of someone who had spent a long time choosing the words. It said that the Celenvane shaft had been reopened, that the Sovereignty's engineering team had reinforced the second level and shored up the transition band that had failed, that Solith Reach had returned to work on a prosthetic fabricated by the Sovereignty's medical rehabilitation program and still went down every shift, that the miners who had been trapped were all working again, that the colony's population had grown by 12, 3 births, and 9 arrivals from other settlements who had heard, through whatever channels mining communities use, that Verath Reach was a place worth coming to. The letter said that the beacon's positioning catalog had been updated to the current epoch standard, and that Verath Reach now transmitted its coordinates correctly, in Sector 14, in Kethvari sovereign space, where it had always been. The letter said one more thing. It said that the colony had filed a formal request with the Kethvari Sovereignty Bureau of Records to add a secondary listing to the settlement's emergency contact registry, a listing that the beacon would never auto-dial because the coordinates no longer mapped to the wrong sector, a listing that would have to be activated manually by a person pressing a key, making a choice. The listing was for Earth Sector 12 Patrol Channel. Sarath wrote, "The drift has been corrected. The beacon now knows where we are, but we have added your frequency to our registry so that if the day comes again, and the shaft gives way again, and the keeper kneels again, next time we will send for you on purpose." I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases. The paper was so thin I could see the shadow of my fingers through it and put it in the ceramic dish beside the token. I don't take them out. I don't need to. I know what they look like. I know what they weigh. I know what the ink smells like when the dish sits in the afternoon sun on my desk, faintly mineral, like the air on Verath Reach. I know that a chaplain knelt on a stone floor for more than 20 hours waiting for ships that were aimed at the wrong sky, and that we came anyway, and that the chaplain kept the vigil for us too. We were not sent for. The firmware drifted. The coordinates were wrong. The beacon called a sector that was not ours for a people we did not know on a world we had never mapped. I have been a medic for 9 years since Verath Reach. I have treated burns and fractures and decompression injuries on 6 worlds and 4 orbital stations. I have set bones in 0 gravity and stopped bleeding in a dust storm and performed field triage in the cargo hold of a freighter with no lights and no heat. None of it weighs what that token weighs. 19 years of drift, 9 hours of transit, a chaplain kneeling for miners in the dark, and us, 34 people on 3 ships, answering a signal that was never meant for us because the numbers said here, and the numbers were wrong, but the people were real. The people were real, and we came and we stayed, and the beacon has been corrected. But the frequency is still in their registry.